Good morning and welcome to everybody for the last talk within this series of talks which are titled The Collector as Producer. I'm very happy to welcome here in Milan Theo Westreich and Ethan Wagner, that I deeply thank for accepting this invitation, and Tom Morton, that I also thank so much for coming and moderating this talk. I believe that the most of you are very familiar with Ethan Wagner and Theo Westreich, that are extremely good and passionate and committed collectors and art advisors. And for us, it was very important to have them here within this specific series of talks that, of course, we conceived to investigate ways for collectors not only to be buyers for works, but also to be actively involved in discussions. We call it producer because the producer is a word that means many things. So it's not only about commissioning, but also about basically having a daily commitment with the artists, with the curators, with the institutions, with the biennials. And so how a figure as a curator can enter these discourses and participate into the production of the art, which is a wide concept. We're not just speaking about supporting the production of a piece, the physical production of a piece, but being part of a wider debate around the production and the distribution of art. And we also invited Tom Morton, who is curator and contributing editor of Frieze, to discuss themes with Eren and Tia, themes that are very clearly articulated within this book that has been recently published with Faden, that is found here. It's Collecting Art for Love, Money, and More. And I think that in this particular moment, I think it's a very important, this tension between love and money. Of course, we cannot avoid the fact that collecting is a matter of passion, of true commitment with the art, but also of course we're witnessing a rising involvement of people that collect for money. And then I think that I will leave you now the word, because I'm also very curious to know about the more, which is So thank you again for being here. At the end of the talk, there will be also a book signing right here at the exit of the talk, and I'll leave the word to you, to Tom.
Great. Thank you very much, Alessandro. Hello. As Alessandro mentioned briefly, our departure point for our discussion today is Theo and Ethan's book, Collecting Art for Love, Money, and More. And this is a book that I've recently finished reading. And it's one, I think, of great use to collectors and prospective collectors. But it's also one I'm going to recommend to my students. I teach in an MFA program in England. And I think it's a really good guide for art students who are just about to enter the market as providers of goods, as much as anything else. It's a book that is sometimes quite playful in its language. There's a wonderful line in which a biennale is described as a good opportunity to shop, which is very funny, I think. And art Basel Miami is described as a hejira, which is a word I had to look up, which I understand alludes to Muhammad's flight from Mecca to Medina. So it's a book that wears its learning lightly, but there's a lovely quote that appears near the beginning from Walter Benjamin, which I think perhaps goes some way to capturing the more of the book's title, which is Benjamin here is writing about collecting and the collector. For inside him there are spirits, or at least little genii, which have seen to it that for a collector, and I mean a real collector, a collector as he ought to be, ownership is the most intimate relationship one can have to objects. not that they come alive in him. It is he who lives in them. And I think, that's some sort of measure of the kind of interest of this book. It's not just a practical guide. There's something more going on. So I'd like to ask you both, what were your motivations for writing this, for putting this out in the world?
Well, I think somewhat twofold. First, I don't want to overstate it, but we see so much written about the art world that's connected with the art market and prices and increases in value and that sort of thing. And our world, we're aware of the price of objects and what happens to them, up or down, but that the world we occupy, quite frankly, is a different world. And while there's an awareness of value, there are transcending matters of that Walter Benjamin said better than we could ever say it. So we wanted to sort of take the flag of passion and plant it in the ground and say, at least in our small effort, look, there's another entire aspect to the art world that has very, very little to do with economic value. And then the other aspect of motivating us was that, at least what was in my head, and Thea can add to this, I thought that if one or two people picked up our book because they hear something about art, contemporary art, collecting, that sort of thing, if they picked up the book and at the end of it said, I'm going to give this a try, I'm going to see if I can get involved in collecting art, that would be an enormous satisfaction to us because it's defined our life. And lo and behold, and then I'll be done with this, shortly after the book came out, somebody called from the country of Turkey and said that he had picked up the book and he was thinking of being an art collector, but now he had a course set. He knew how he was going to go about it, and he was going to become a collector. I haven't heard from him. Maybe he's been terribly disappointed, but that was very, very satisfying. But you want to add?
I have very little to add to what Ethan has said, except that we were tired of talking to one another about the joys of art and collecting, so we thought we'd write something instead of just jabber to each other.
I think, as you've kind of very ably put, this is a book to some degree about pleasure, yeah? And could you talk to me a little bit about the pleasures of collecting? What is it that keeps you, I understand you have a collection of some 900 works. You've amassed a huge library of art books. I think it's something like 13,000 volumes.
And growing.
And growing, okay. And of course, these things never stop, There's no kind of cap on your library, there's no cap on your collection. Could you talk a little about the pleasures of collecting and immersing yourself in the world of artists?
Go ahead. Yeah.
I think the real pleasure of collecting is the absolute intensity of the following of curiosity, the possibility that you can learn something every single day and still not know half of what you want or a quarter of what you want, the excitement of discovery, the wonderful relationships that you have in the art world, writers, critics, dealers, above all artists, even other collectors, the discourse, the excitement of conversation about ideas, and the fact that there is no period at the end of any sentence. It just goes on, and the possibilities of understanding one's time, one's moment in history is available through art-making practices and through the kind of interpretation of what it means to be alive today. And our day begins with the New York Times, which Ethan and I love to read together and to wonder about different stories, different perspectives on what's happening in our world. And then the day begins, and it's art for the rest of the day, and there is no end to the journey, and that's what I love.
I would only add that that truly great artists are, and some not so great artists are really great minds. They're great intellects, and I don't claim to have that kind of intellect, but the art world gives us an opportunity to hitch a ride, sort of to go along with these minds and as best we can understand people who are very, very interesting and obviously creative and bring a perspective on contemporary culture that we couldn't think of ourselves. So when we're in a studio and have an experience with an artist or stand in front of an installation or a video or a painting or a sculpture, and it takes us to a place that we don't know about and we couldn't invent on our own, it's one long, for me, it's one long sigh. And it's the more, I think, more than anything else, the more in the title is not so much the social world or the other aspects, which are all attractive about the art world, or some of it's attractive. It's that experience when you're engaged with something that's just very special.
So yeah, kind of what Nabokov called the sob in the spine, I think, yeah? So, of course, you are advisors. You know, you're not only collectors yourselves, you help others begin and maintain and grow their collections. What do you say when a new client comes to you and says, I don't know very much about art, perhaps I know nothing about art, but I'd like to start a collection? What's the first thing you say to them?
Well, the first thing is that it's absolutely possible, and that knowing nothing is in a way a very exciting platform from which to begin. Our job as collectors is not to assemble a protocol of you buy this, you don't buy that. Our job as advisors is to curate a great collection for somebody through their eyes, through their curiosity, through their temptations. And a perfect example is a collector that was one of our very, very first in the early 80s. And he was a man in, by the way, his early 80s. And he said, look, I want to buy art. I want to get a beautiful collection. His wife was substantially younger, and I think he wanted to engage in a world that was a little enlivening for her. And he said, look, I love this, I love this. His entire house was filled with paintings, not one of which was worth a bottle of water. They were so uninteresting. But what prevailed was color and abstraction. And so slowly over time, we built a really very important collection of post-abstract expressionism and very well selected early American modernism. And his wife had actually indicated that she loved flowers. So we bought Demuth, the most magnificent drawings that he's well known for, but they're an aside to his practice. And in the end, he had a fantastic, fantastic collection. And that's the goal and objective, is to find the passion somewhere in the heart and the mind of the collector, and then help them articulate it and help them begin a journey.
Well, it's really the business that Thea started before Art Advisor was such a loosely used term, and I can shed a little light on how Thea goes about this, because several years ago, two young men came to our office and said that they wanted to collect, but they only had 50,000 a year to spend. And Thea came home at the end of the day so excited because they wanted to learn. And she said, "You won't believe these fantastic two people that came to the office today. It's going to cost us money to service the account, but the education that we're going to be able to give them, it will be so exciting." And that thrilled her more than any time I can remember somebody coming into the office with a more substantial budget.
And so if I, for example, were to start collecting with, a modest budget like that, how would you encourage me to begin? I mean, how would you encourage me? Where should I look, what should I read?
Well, the first thing you should do is basically look art historically. I think the most important thing that's missing from the contemporary art world right now and it's not universal, but generally speaking, I think the contemporary art world lacks a real knowledge of art history. And by that, I don't mean a PhD in the history of art, but I mean a general understanding of where art comes from, what art is about, what has already happened in art, so that you can eliminate things that look like art and begin to be available to newer ideas. And the younger generation and some of the younger galleries, essentially, once you have that sense of art history, is the place to start. And we're very lucky, especially now, all over the world, in virtually every city that Ethan and I have traveled, there are young gallerists working with young artists and selling art at really affordable prices. And further to that point, those gallerists are really passionate and tend to give you an enormous amount of information and education just talking to them. And then if you're lucky enough to get to know the artists and be in the studio, then you've reached nirvana. And you don't need to spend a lot of money to have those opportunities.
I mean, can you talk a little about how, I imagine you guys do lots of studio visits. How do you manage a studio visit? I mean, what are your expectations before? What do you hope to draw out of it?
We are very, maybe we're different than many collectors in that we like to get to know the artists. And collectors have said to us over time, I don't want to be compromised by a personal relationship with an artist. It's going to interfere with my decision making. And I think we can respect that. But our impulse is to, if we see something, and it usually starts with seeing the work of art, it doesn't start with getting to know the artist. If we start to see work by an artist that we find compelling, it's our instinct to want to get to know the mind that made that work. And I suppose we're lucky. I mean, I know we're lucky in the place we're in the art world, because there are a lot of studios that it's very difficult to get into those studios. The artists aren't inclined to normally engage in that kind of dialogue. Maybe it's our enthusiasm that prevails, but we go to studios all the time to try to get to understand better the impulses that are behind the work. And today, or last decade or two, when so much work is conceptually based, that understanding of the practice and what the artist is thinking about sometimes can be gathered a little bit better by a one-to-one dialogue, and then amplified by reading what critics have to say about a particular artist. Then there are many cases where those initial meetings with artists evolve into ongoing relationships. And for us, apart from our family, that's the most important constant in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to add that that constant means that there's this constant dialogue and investigation and curiosity and discourse and argument that takes place with these people, and these people are the creators of our time. But I have a very interesting story that I think illustrates the answer. There's a young artist in Brooklyn that our practice has been very interested in, and there wasn't a lot of work to look at, and in fact, this artist doesn't even really have a studio per se. He works in the back of his apartment. And we had asked to meet him and go to the studio, and of course there is no studio, so he met us at this little gallery in Brooklyn, and after meeting him and talking to him for a while, we said, let's go have a drink. And at that moment, unhappily, Ethan had a really bad back, and so he went home. And I stayed and had a couple of drinks with the artist. And when I got home, Ethan said, well, tell me, how did you react to the work? What did you think? And I said, honestly, I have no idea about anything of the work that we talked about. He was totally not communicative about that, but I guarantee you he's a great artist. And there was something so enlivening in the conversation and so essential in the vocabulary that he was using to speak about everything. And it could be the weather. And I know this kid is a good artist. And I tried to explain that to Ethan, and his face lit up. And it was as though he understood completely the evaluation that I was making. And in truth, it had nothing to do specifically with the practice. I just knew the kid was bright.
Just to go back in time, when Thea and I got to know each other, which was about 23 years ago, Thea already had a long-standing relationship with the American painter Christopher Wool. So by virtue of that relationship, I had the enormous pleasure of, over the years, visiting, the two of us visiting Christopher for many years. It was every few months in his studio. And he's to watch him move paintings around, the kind of the schizophrenia, if you will, that's in the art is in the conversation. So he'll say, yeah, I kind of like that one, and 15 minutes later, that one is virtually out of the upcoming exhibition, and you know, you never see it again, and it's painted over. Sometimes it's not even words in the studio. It's something communicated about watching the artist, just hearing them amble along about what it is they're doing and which was the most recent work of art. There's something that comes across, and I don't know how to describe it or quantify it, but I know that it's informed our collecting and our advising.
It's given us a vocabulary, actually. That word schizophrenia truly defines that body of work, Christopher, from the very beginning to today. There's this real schizophrenia about what really makes a painting and why he does things, why he doesn't do things, and it's all there. I mean, it's in the work. And not to see that is to lose the power of its presence and your experience of it.
I'm interested in the notion that collecting is possibly a creative act. I mean, do you feel it's a way, as a creative act, do you feel that's your the outlet for your creativity?
Yeah, I do. I think it's a journey. It's self-defining, but it also has to be, if you're looking from outside at a particular collection, one needs to understand that it reflects the passions of the collector. It reflects the intelligence, in a way, of the collector, the insight, the knowledge, the budget of the collector. I think that all too often that issue of budget is ignored when collections are looked at and people think, well, why didn't they buy this or why didn't they buy that? In our case, a lot of what we love is way out of our financial means. And I rather expect that for most collectors, and I think for most great collectors, there's a limit. I've often thought if there was no budgetary limit, I somehow don't think that that's going to be an accumulation of very good sculpture, painting, what have you, but it's not necessarily going to be a great collection. A budget limit that all of us face forces you to deal with the issues of affordability, of choice.
I think, though, to expand on that and further answer your question, every collection, I believe, every great collection is curated, self-curated. A budget plays a part, but as well, you tend to respond to a certain aspect in a practice, which does not mean that everything that you buy looks like the other thing.
Sure.
Nor does it mean that everything is compelled by the same ideas. But somehow when you walk into a collector's home, a good collector, you will see something that lets you know why certain choices were made. There's a certain, as we keep saying, this journey, it's really like reading a great book. You're turning pages. You're seeing new ideas. You're watching something evolve. You're seeing a story and learning the undercurrent, and it's thoroughly thrilling, but it also requires a discipline. It requires, this is really what we should be doing. This is something we can walk away from. And that's happening every day for every real collector.
And could you describe, the through line in your collection? What is it that, characterizes your collection? Is this, and also, of course, this is a collection developed by two people, so it's to some degree a portrait of a relationship as well, right?
Yeah, it is that.
Can I just say one thing? That is the toughest question to answer.
Okay.
And but I want to say that the two of us, were both collectors before we met, and coming together as collectors and as partners has been for us one of the greatest thrills of our marriage. And it actually, in a sense, defines our marriage because we don't argue. And we have lots of discussions and we take different positions, but I have to say we've never disagreed about the acquisition of a work of art.
Really?
So
that's extraordinary.
that is extraordinary.
Yeah.
Now you
No,
say
actually,
what,
it's.
Answer the question.
We couldn't say what it is, what thread finds its way through our collection. Because we're donating the vast majority of the works we own to two museums. We've had the opportunity to sit with the curators of each institution, and they seem to have a notion of what it is that coheres the collection, if indeed it coheres. I don't think I could get to first base with that.
Okay, I'm going to give it a go,
Okay,
okay?
fantastic.
Just because Tom's
very
asked a
brave.
really tough question. I think what defines our collection is an engagement with the art of our time. So, for example, in 1980, 1985, 1986, that period of time in New York, in the Lower East Side, was defined by a certain number of artists that at the time, when I was collecting alone, I felt was really important to that moment in history. Jeff Koons, Christopher Wool, Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, Bob Gober, there are many in that group, all of whom were completely affordable. And being in a studio, for example, of Jeff Koons, which was at 99 Maiden Lane, a quarter the size of this room, and purchasing basically 2 boxes of vacuums is an experience that can only be had at the beginning of a career. Now, could we have bought Balloon Dog, which arguably is Jeff's most important work of art? No. But we could engage with him, learn from him, grow with him. And the same with that generation. There comes a time when that generation is, first of all, way out of your budget, and second of all, not so much engaged with issues of your time. You're looking for ideas that are investigative, and you move on. And in each, I think what we're learning with the Whitney and the Pompidou is that we kind of have generations of things. I guess that's one of the joys of being old, and probably the only one that I can think of, is that, yes, we have the 80s, and we have a really good idea of what that sort of post-Warholian Pollock generation was investigating, and then we moved on. And we're going to continue to move on. And like I said with this young kid that I had drinks with in Brooklyn, that's where the thrill is. We can't go back and buy a great Christopher Wool anymore. We passed that 20 years ago. So the fun and what really sparks the collection is the engagement with the now. So it is, in fact, a journey. I hope that.
That's great, yeah.
Yeah, but
mean,
I actually don't think you got to the question.
All right, Tom's happy.
I think what.
Tom's happy.
All right.
I mean, to some degree, it's an impossible. I mean, hopefully, all good collections.
I know this.
Mean multiply, yeah. You know?
I know this, that probably for 20 years, if somebody, a knowledgeable person, came in and looked at the collection, they'd call it a conceptual art collection. But that's not all it is, and maybe that's more a reflection of a prevailing impulse in art-making practices today. Interestingly enough, there's the curator at the Pompidou has asked somebody to write an essay for the catalog that will be published on our the exhibition of our collection, to write an essay on this, on the idea of abstraction, which in her mind finds its way through the collection. And when she said that to us, we both looked at each other and said, abstraction. Because we didn't collect with the idea of building a collection of abstract art, but somebody seeing that in the collection.
Malay, yes, of course, yeah.
So you're basically like describing collecting through this close relationship with the artist as also a way to be like a sort of an antenna for what's going on. You know, like it's a very interesting point, because that means that you're basically capturing a feeling of the moment. So you started like speaking about like what was happening in New York in the early 80s. What are your feelings? What do you see happening now in the younger generation? Do you see like a shift into the understanding of things? Do you see like a shift into the language, into the concern that they express?
Can I answer that? I think we do, and in fact, we've been discussing it a lot between us. I want to say that the relationships that you form with artists and writers and curators and people engaged in trying to answer that question, by the way, is very exciting. And it's not just the artist, it's, I can't tell you how many different people have entered our world, many of whom are curators and writers, and some even, you know, composers and musicians, and it's a world that's very fecund. But I think what we're seeing now is a very, very extreme industrial revolution. I think that the introduction of trains and planes and cars and the camera and all the things that happened at the turn of the century and created such extraordinary art, I kind of feel like we're doing that times 1,000. That the internet and the types of ways we interpret science and mathematics, not that we interpret, that is evolving in our culture. Artists are having to deal with that, and I think they're developing new communication strategies with that new language. And some of it is very didactic and very limited, and basically a narrative about that language, and others is really abstract, complicated, full, and rich, and ultimately, we believe, really great art.
And can you give us some names, maybe?
Well, I just like to add, because I feel too that this is maybe because we're older than most. This is an incredible time, and if you just look at what's going on in the world with architecture, what's being discovered in physics, and most importantly, how communication is changing, you'd have to be dead, dumb, and blind not to see that visual artists would take up these changes.
Sure.
and deal with them. So over the 35 or so years that I've been collecting, I feel this is this moment in time, not yesterday, it's been going on for several years now, is just a particularly rich period, and one that for collecting is rife with opportunities. Yeah, go ahead.
Can I answer?
Yeah, great. Oh, you are going to give names. Wonderful.
All right, we don't.
This is free art advice.
Yeah, free. We began a certain investigation
Does
with.
somebody have a vodka before she starts doing it?
Early. We began a certain investigation with Cheney Thompson and Sam Lewitt and Sean Paul and Scott Lyle, a large community of young artists about 10 years ago. And that led us to understanding the certain kinds of systems, complicated systems, that guided an investigation. And as we continue, certainly these artists continue to challenge us and interest us, and please understand that list is longer and fuller, but those names come to mind quickly. And now what we're able to see is an extension of this notion of language and vocabulary that's different. And they're younger artists, like, for example, Ian Chang, who's showing here, somebody even like Michael E. Smith, whose vocabulary has nothing to do with internet or complicated strategies, but at the same time it does. And it's about a certain vision. There's a young artist working in Brooklyn who's French, who's basically using the language of these little iPads and the things that kids use all the time. It's a new language. It's not letters. It's abstractions of language. And this artist is using that as part of his practice. So it's an exciting moment, and there are wonderful things to learn, and I'm sure the list is much longer.
Wonderful.
Yeah, the list is longer, but I often hear that if there are collectors in the audience, young collectors, I should say, not really experienced collectors who may know more than we do. I often, when you get to the list of names of who people are interested in, I often hear the term, that artist is a mistake. And I don't believe collecting is about that. I don't think collecting is defined by what list you or we come up with. They're the artists that interest us. But and we might, in late at night, make a list of artists that don't interest us, that somebody else can get as much out of as the artists that we're collecting. So if that is the case, and it's a hard thing to say because we really believe that a lot of the people that we're collecting are extraordinary, and I know you're going to argue this point.
No, what?
I'm simply saying that our list is not the defining list. Our list is nothing
Yes,
more
it
than
is. I have one thing to say that's really important to answer the question. Having said that there's certain things that interest us and their themes, yesterday Ethan and I planned a whole new collecting strategy for ourselves. So we're going to go, and this happened because of a gallery visit, and we looked at this artist, and Francesca, it reminded us of this artist that I have known for 25 years, 30 years, through Hudson. And it never came into our screen. Yesterday, it came into our screen, thanks to Francesca, and we started to look at all of the books. And when we walked out, Ethan and I said, okay, we talked about this, we can devise a new collecting strategy. We can use our house in the country to extend our interest in design and work a collection around those issues. And we have things already in the collection that do that, like Jorge Pardo. And then we can use our loft in the city and continue our investigation of these very, very young and emerging artists, and then have a two-pronged collection. What does that do? It gives us an excuse to buy more things.
Of course.
And unfortunately, keep working, because that's the only way we're going to be able to do it.
I think quite soon I want to turn it over to you guys. I'm sure you have questions for Thea and Ethan. But one final question, and we've talked a lot about this privileged space of having time to read and research, of doing studio visits. I mean, what's your experience of something that's a little more kind of chaotic, perhaps abrasive, like an art fair? I mean, do you... Okay. So,
art fairs are both, they're absolutely the bane of our existence and the ultimate joy of our practice. They're so rich in opportunity, but you have to stay until the last day when everybody that is social goes home and the dealers are exhausted and sitting in their booths ready to go to sleep, and then you get to really learn. You start to talk to the dealers, you ask them what they're doing back at home, what they're interested in, why they have what they have on the walls. And that's the moment where you can basically cover an international art world in one place and talk to lots of different people about why they're interested in certain things, what they're showing, and learning about artists you've never seen before.
I would just add there are enormous benefits to art fairs and enormous complications and difficulties. The one thing that stands out for me is our preference is to see monographic shows, one-person shows in gallery spaces, to sit down with the work, to spend time looking at it. If we have the opportunity to discuss the work with the dealer or the gallerist, and really maybe put something on reserve, go back home, talk about it, think about it some more, go visit the show again, make a choice, don't make a choice. That is by far our preference. And I think that for all the benefits that fairs bring to the commercial art world and to the collecting community, they're marginalizing that kind of experience that I just talked about. And I think that that's showing up in the practices of artists. I think it's a problem for the art world and art-making practices, and it's going to be interesting to see how it kind of plays out over the next decade.
I also want to add that this can happen at an art fair, but it's more likely to happen in a gallery context. Many, many years ago, Ethan and I were told by somebody that we respect, you've got to go visit this young gallerist, Andrew Krebs. It was when the very, very beginning. And so we went in and we looked at what was on the wall, and we just started a discussion. And 3 hours later, we were still going through pages of images of artists that Andrew represented, many of which we collected then and now. But it was just the time. I hate to say it, but time is essential. And it was going through what he was showing, why he was showing it, what was of interest to him, and then looking at the books that he had assembled in support of those ideas, which happened yesterday at Francesca's gallery. There's this, it's almost like a ride. You know, you go from one stop on the subway to the next stop on the subway to the next, and then you get to 42nd Street and you see all those great big things in the middle of 42nd Street. To me, the art fairs provide that a little bit. It's at the end, but the gallery visits perhaps more. And in my view, museum monographic shows.
That's where it's at.
Absolutely number one, where you get a totally independent curator trying to show a body of work by one artist. And that is, I remember going to Bern to see the Leger Contrast and Form show. All of them assembled in one room. You will never, no one can do that anymore.
And we just had that experience a few days ago in Naples at Patrick Timoney's show.
Curated by the lovely Alessandra. Speaking of time, we're almost out of it. So, Alessandra, do we have time for questions from the floor? So if you would wrap up.
Yeah, I mean, sure, if somebody in the audience has a question, please ask. I just wanted to touch briefly on another point, because you now mentioned the role of the solo exhibitions in institutions, and you just briefly touched the point that you've been donating an extremely vast number of works to institutions, which basically configure the role of the collection not only as, let's say, a privilege, but also as a form of responsibility, because you're contributing to the memory of the future, what will be the narratives that in the future the institution they will deliver to the public. So I think it's this basically always been like that. The museums, they were based on donations of private individuals. But I think that especially now, if we consider at least in Europe, for example, the institution, they have less and less money to buy. So what comes from private individuals, it's a fundamental contribution to the public collection. That's why I think that today it's very important to stress this role of the collector as a responsible subject that delivers a narrative in itself. You were saying that, for example, good collections are curated because they deliver like a sort of a narrative. So would you say something about this, your relationship with the institutions that you decided to donate a large number of works, and how you are involving in further conversations with them?
Yeah, I think that a simple and a spot-on description of what we had in mind was we feel that the experience that art has given us has virtually defined the joy of our life, and certainly the key joy, apart from, as I said, from family, of our time together. And we feel the artists are really, notwithstanding my comments to the contrary, we feel the artists are in the collection are very, very important. And we feel an obligation to them not to if they're worthwhile, to give them to institutions where their work will be well taken care of and seen. And anecdotally, when we first met with the Pompidou, which was a couple of years ago, at that moment in time, there were 27 European artists in our collection. And when we sat down with the curatorial staff to discuss the possibility of our gift, 23 of the 27 artists were on their wish list. So to us, it's a done deal at that point. We know they're going to be well taken care of. That's what mattered to us.
And by the way, that 27 different artists numbers over 350 works. So what we felt, to more specifically answer your question, we could have given all of it to one institution like the Tate or the Modern, but the collection really fills a need at the Whitney and at the Pompidou, as Ethan described. And we took a lot of time thinking about where the collection could be best used, rather than, which was the biggest or the best. And both of us had a very strong feeling about the curatorial focus of those institutions.